I just finished Mistborn Era 1, the first trilogy, and I absolutely loved it. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk about what happened, whether any of the predictions that I made came true, and what I'm going to be reading next. So let's jump into it. What the Mistborn trilogy has showed me is that Brandon Sanderson can tie up a story with an incredible amount of personal satisfaction and neatness tied into it. Because this story, although at times does seem quite simple, it actually gets very, very complex throughout, and then he manages to tie it together pretty much seamlessly at the end. And it's rare that in fantasy you get such a satisfying end. So the first thing I have to say is bravo for the way that he finished it. The first thing I want to talk about is the Kandra storyline. And I think I got my first and only moment in this trilogy where I got goosebumps from reading. And to get goosebumps whilst reading something is difficult because it's not only something epic that has to be happening, it has to be something that's been built up, or a problem that's been built up for a long time, a large part of the story. It needs to be a big problem. And then whatever happens, the implication has to be massive moving forwards. And not only does all of that need to happen, but you also need to feel a lot of emotion and empathy for whoever or whatever is getting that moment in the story. And the moment that I got it was when Sazed heard Tensoon talking about the announcer, and it changes everything. He drops to his knees, he starts to believe, he then questions Tensoon, draws out the answers from him, rebuilds his belief, and then goes again on his quest. And that was the one and only time that I managed to get goosebumps whilst reading this trilogy, and it was incredible. Obviously those moments are amazing. Another moment in a different series that I can liken it to, maybe not to the same scale, but that also gave me goosebumps. If you've read The Wheel of Time, when Nynaeve says to the Malkyries that the golden crane flies to Tarmon Gaidon, and it just like shows, because it's such a long journey to that moment, and then the implication from that moment forwards is massive for what's going to happen for the rest of the story. And I think it's similar to what we get here, which is why that moment gave me goosebumps as well. So we learn that Mistwraiths were feruchemists, and the first Kandras were the packmates of Rashek, the Lord Ruler. And did I predict this? No, absolutely not. I was miles away. However, I did vocalize that Mistwraiths are the only strange being that don't seem to have been created via hemalurgic spikes or by ruin or by preservation, it would seem. So definitely not claiming that I predicted that, but Mistwraiths were an anomaly of the story. So it is satisfying to know where they came from. I thought maybe the Mistwraiths were going to be left as an unknown, but now looking at it, it's quite obvious their connection to the Kandra. And I know that it was mentioned previously that the Mistwraiths and the Kandra were almost like cousins, same as the Kandra and the Colossus as well. So it is satisfying to know where the Mistwraiths fit into this. We also find that the Kandra had the Atium. This is one that I did predict. As soon as Tensoon gave us his perspective when he went back to the Kandra homeland, and he was standing on that big, I think it was steel, potentially, maybe it was silver, like platform, and it was called the Trust, and it was big enough for a lot of stuff to be inside it. I knew the Atium was going to be in there, but it was still a really cool place for the Atium to be, because the Atium has been tied to the storyline for so long. It's pretty much immediately where we think the power for the Lord Ruler is potentially coming from as well, like where he's using it, how he's keeping it, even though we think it's in a money sense to begin with. And obviously that wasn't my first guess as to where the Atium was, because we had no idea really about the Kandra. I went through probably 5 to 10 different guesses and ideas of where the Atium was hidden or what it was used for and why we couldn't find it. And the one that I think was the coolest idea that I had, and it might not be possible now because we know that the Atium is actually like a physical manifestation of Ruin's power. So maybe it doesn't work like this. But we found out you can become a savant of a metal. And I had an idea that the Lord Ruler was just burning the Atium constantly. So it would be cool to know what becoming an Atium savant would be like. Because I feel like if it was possible, kind of like how with Spook and the tin, I think it is, that he burns and he can see further, feel better. He just basically had a much higher power and mastery of tin than anybody else. If that was the same with Atium, maybe you'd just be able to see into the future indefinitely or for a longer period of time. And maybe you'd be able to see past what somebody's going to do physically to what they're going to do in like a week or a month's time. And I thought that was a really cool idea. But no, the Atium is the body of Ruin, or not the body, the physical manifestation of Ruin's power, and it should be his body as well. Kind of really cool outcome. So the Kandra do have a special part in the story. Not only is Tensoon vital to the story, but they are the only beings that are heavily affected by hemalurgy that were able to resist. And the resolution was simply pulling the hemalurgic spikes out of their own body. And I think that was really cool. I think that showed that Ruin didn't have a stranglehold on everybody. And again, it just goes to show the foresight of the Lord Ruler, Rashek, who I believe is one of the most important people to this story. But I'm going to talk about that later. I would actually like to award an MVP of the story a little bit later, so stick around if you want to hear about that. Another thing that I managed to predict was the earring. I thought the earring it was strange how much page time and how much it was mentioned right at the start of the first book. And although I didn't know obviously about hemalurgic spikes, etc., I did catch on relatively early. I think that it was Ruin talking to her, not her brother. And then it became quite obvious that that was the reason she was unable to touch the mists. And to see her constantly put the earring back in her ear after I had guessed it quite a long time before was so frustrating. But I feel like that one was really obvious. You tell me, was that something that you guessed quite early? Because I feel like the signs for that and the clues were quite blatant. And then, of course, I have to talk about Marsh again. And I feel bad because in the first book, I thought maybe Marsh was a traitor. And then he really turns out to be the MVP of the first book, in my opinion. Like what he does basically changes everything, pulling all the spikes out of the Inquisitors and being turned into an Inquisitor himself. And we now know that Ruin must have been speaking to him and the Lord Ruler speaking to him. And he managed to either evade notice or overcome that. And the second book, he's not really in it. He's in and out. He's being controlled by Ruin. And then the third book, I kind of forgot about him. Even though we had a lot of it from his perspective, so much was happening near the end that I forgot that he was still in the story, if that makes sense. So for him to show back up and to be able to be the one who pulls the earring out of Vin's ear, even though he has a bajillion spikes through him, and therefore Ruin's hold over him must be more impressive than any, more total and controlling than the control that Ruin has over anybody else. It just shows how important he is, and he definitely is in the running for MVP of the story as well. So hats off to Marsh, and I would say he probably had the most tragic storyline as well. It's definitely the most difficult. He didn't really have any fun. I don't remember any scene where he's like laughing or enjoying himself. Even when like Kelsier's alive and Marsh is alive and he's not been turned into an Inquisitor, he's quite a solemn person. And it's clear that he'd lost the girl he loved to his brother and then to death already. So he does obviously get his redemption with how important he is in the story, but yeah, he definitely has the most difficult time throughout the trilogy. And if there's anyone I wouldn't want to be, it would probably be Marsh, even though I'm super impressed by him. So on to the gods, Ruin and Preservation. And the first thing that was really cool that I was nowhere near guessing at all, didn't even have a clue, was how the 16% was with regards to the 16 metals. And 16 was the Lord Ruler's number, which was really like Preservation and Ruin's number. It's like a godly number, essentially, is how I interpreted it anyway. And when we discover that Preservation, or the Mists, had been snapping people, turning them to Mistings, and not just to Mistings, but some of them to Mistborns, and then those Mistborns, it just shows that Preservation's foresight as well was very impressive, because Preservation must have known that they would have been, those ones who became Mistborns would have been extradited from the main army, maybe even knew that they would be needed to eat and swallow and burn the Atium. Crazy. So good, so well planned, didn't feel cheap at all, didn't feel like a magical solution that we sometimes get. It felt like it was in keeping. And Brandon Sanderson's ideas of these two all-knowing, all-powerful gods who can see what people are doing and influence them, it's really good because of so many reasons. But the main one is it does allow you to explain away coincidences in a way that doesn't feel cheap. It's like, well, that's what these gods are all about. They're smarter than us. They move things around. It's all about the faith and belief in what they're able to do. And you can take that faith and belief and apply it to the story and allow yourself to enjoy the story more. So it's a really cool concept. It was kind of a concept that was difficult to execute, but once you had the execution down, it's kind of impossible to have a bad story because we have these all-powerful beings that are pushing and forcing on everybody in the story. So, oh, there's a coincidence. Someone was in the right place at the right time. Let's look back through the storyline. We can see where they were pushing that direction and we can attribute it to one of these gods. So, incredible idea overall. And that scene where the Mistborn were battling and fighting, and we had Elend leading them. And in terms of character growth, Elend is miles ahead of anybody else, I think. Like, Vin is obviously a contender for character growth, but she always had this kind of street smarts. She was afraid, but she also was always going to go and do what she felt she needed to do. She was quite ruthless, whereas Elend progressed into this position and this role, and we saw a lot of that progression in the second book, and then we saw the outcomes of it in the third book as well. But him leading the Mistborns, fighting, battling, and then finally using Duralumin with Atium at the same time. And when he hits the Duralumin boost with the Atium and he says, "I see now," or something along those lines, it's just perfect, because obviously he was able to see with a little bit of the clarity of a god, even just for a second or 5 seconds or 10 seconds or however long Duralumin lasts. So well done. And yeah, obviously we get his death, but I'm going to talk about the deaths in a minute because I think they deserve their own little section. Another character that I loved, or maybe loved to hate, was just Ruin. I just talked about how impressive the ideas were for Ruin and Preservation, but Ruin really stole the show because he had personality throughout the duration, especially once he was manifesting himself like physically, and he was so cool. Like, he felt like a worthy opponent for any fantasy book or fantasy setting. Like, nobody would have an easy time against Ruin. There was no simple fix or simple solution to it. Like, it was all difficult, and he really was able to play. The term I used last time was 4-dimensional chess. He was able to play 4-dimensional chess because he could see everything, do everything, and had this godlike understanding and clarity and clairvoyance of what was going to go down. So the level of cunning that he showed was so fun to read. And then we have the bombshell. And this was so well done by Brandon Sanderson, because I would guess almost everybody else, potentially, I was just convinced that Vin was the hero of ages. I had stopped thinking about it. I didn't think there were any other options. Like, I thought it was quite clear from the first book, I thought so. And then the second book, that's the question, right? Is she the hero of ages? But then she does release Ruin. She does go to the Well of Ascension. And I just stopped questioning it. I just thought, okay, yeah, obviously Vin is the hero of ages. And although it was brought up still and there was a lot of clues, I bet if I reread this, it will be quite obvious that it isn't. It's Sazed. Sazed is the hero of ages. And I thought he was just having like an internal belief crisis, because it was fun to read. Like, it was interesting. It applies to some people in the real world, these belief crises, like crises. Everybody goes through them at one point, whether it's like religious or just in yourself or in something you thought about for a long time. It's just like an interesting idea to grapple with, and he was such a great character to grapple with it because of his level of logic and how he goes about things. So I just thought that was a really fun storyline, and it was going to be really just influential to the story as a whole. But then he ends up being the hero of ages, and it perfectly fits because all of his abilities, his metal minds, allow him to rebuild the world. And it's like so obvious, but I just didn't get it at all. I did not get it at all. You tell me, did you know Sazed was going to be the hero of ages? I didn't guess it in the slightest. And I think it's because, like, the clues are quite obvious now you think about it, but I think it's because I just assumed it was Vin, and I stopped thinking about it. And it's incredible that Sanderson was able to just misdirect me like that, because I so enjoyed the reveal at the end. And Sazed is now God. I think he said Harmony, potentially. No, maybe not Harmony. Was it Harmony? I can't remember. There was a word for him. Basically, he was ruin and preservation at the same time. I think they called him Harmony at the end. But obviously, the Cosmere is bigger than this. And the things that got me the most excited are obviously the 2 extra base metals. That is interesting. I don't know what they could be. But the more interesting thing is I would like to know more about the red-haired man and the black-haired man with the hook nose or eagle nose, it was considered. And those were the 2 people who had been the body, or maybe the mind, or maybe both, it was the mind of ruin and preservation. Because when Vin became preservation, or preservation became Vin, we got her perspective, and she seemed like she was very much herself still. And I think that's on purpose, right? I think obviously preservation is not going to choose somebody who is very much different to preservation and how preservation wants to exist. They're probably going to choose people who are tailor-made to kind of do what preservation feels like should be done anyway, if that makes sense. So the story of the person, the red-haired man who became the mind of ruin, would be really interesting, because there's obviously someone who's very troubled, wants to destroy, probably had a really tough life. And I don't know if we ever will, but if I could get a bit of information on how those 2 came about and started messing with the world and how that whole story began, I'd be into it for sure. I'd be into it, because maybe those 2 were rivals at one point. They must have been. Maybe they were thousands of years apart. Maybe there were people before them who were ruining preservation. I don't know. It's good that there's so many open-ended, like, it's such a closed story, like everything was well done and I feel completely satisfied with all the storylines, but there are some like, wow, what about that? Things that are in there. So again, really well done with an ending. So about the author, I think what's most impressive is Brandon Sanderson, and I guess most authors do this. He had like a clear vision of what the end was going to be, and then he really intricately brought everything back to the beginning and bled out the information so well. And like the deaths were perfectly in line with the characters. Like we saw the end of Elend, and he died in a sacrificial way doing the right thing, which was just, that was his personality the entire time. He wanted to do the right thing, and then he became someone who did the practical thing as long as it was right as well, if that makes sense. And yeah, he just died doing that, and I think it was just such a well done, developed character arc. His death wasn't cheap like it did. He died like protecting the only people alive that we knew of at that time. And then we have Vin, who died becoming a god, so kind of becoming what I thought at the time was still the hero of ages. And then she died fighting viciously without backing down, non-stop, attacking somebody or something that was bigger and better than her. And then she obviously got those powers, and then she attacked it again, and like that's just in keeping with her personality. And then we had Sazed's ending, and it was to be the peace, to be the like mediator between these 2 powers, and then to become a god and use his metal mines and to be a keeper again, essentially. And it was just so well done. Like the way the characters were in keeping with the main characters were in keeping with what we'd seen so far. And that's not even mentioned really cool characters like Spook that we got, and we got full arcs for in this final book, but I don't even have enough time to talk about him here as well. So I think Brandon Sanderson did an amazing job. Are there things that could have been better? For sure, but I'm going to talk about those in another video when I do like, should you read the Mistborn trilogy, which will probably be up next, so you'll see them there. But I don't want to taint this video with things I think could have changed. This one's just all about the appreciation for the trilogy. I don't think there was any point in these books where I picked them up and I was like, oh, you know, I got to do a bit of reading tonight to get to the next bit, which sometimes happens in series. And this one, there was none. Like, I enjoyed it thoroughly throughout. So I would like to award an MVP, most valuable player, for this book. And obviously, you're probably not going to agree with me. I reckon everybody probably has their own MVP for each story that they've read, but not necessarily just for this story, but for the whole trilogy. And the obvious choices are Vin, we all know why. Elend, again, incredible impact upon the story, huge character growth. We had Tensoon, who was so crucial and vital in allowing the secrets that were needed to be unlocked. We had characters who maybe wouldn't be in the front running, but you could be mentioned people like Spook. You obviously have Kelsier, who was potentially under the influence of Ruin, but also was a catalyst for everything that happened. You had Marsh, who I think is an unsung hero. Well, maybe not. Maybe everyone else was singing his praises, but throughout the story, I wasn't. I thought he was a traitor, and then I kind of forgot about him. I always underestimated Marsh, and he always came through for the gang. But in my head, in my opinion, there's one person who did so much with arguably so little that really set up the world for success. And I think I'd have to give the MVP to Rashek, the Lord Ruler. The reason I give it to Rashek is because, number one, he was alive for a really, really, really long time. And I think that would just weigh on a person anyway. And that doesn't, you know, obviously none of the others got an opportunity to be alive for that long, but that's just like a base layer. Next is he touched and held the power of one of the gods for a short period of time, and he wrought a ton of changes trying to save the world. And he messed up a lot of stuff, but you can see his intentions were really good for the duration. He also sacrificed at the time what he thought was his entire race, and didn't just sacrifice them, he turned them into these like mist wraith things, and then turned them into Kandra, and then created all of these checks and balances across the entirety of the known world to help him battle this ruin creature that he was deathly afraid of. Plus, on top of that, he surely wasn't able to talk to anybody about Ruin, because if he talked to anybody about Ruin and told them the plans, then Ruin would be able to see everything that he was preparing. He would be alerted to it. So he was alive. The reason why I mentioned his lifespan, he was alive for roughly 1,000 years. And during that period of time, he had to carry the weight of what could be happening and the battle he was facing and the preparations and just the knowledge of what he did and what he had to become on his own. And a problem shared is a problem halved. So it must have been the heaviest thing in the world. And on top of that, he was hated by pretty much everybody in the world. Like the Scar weren't too happy with him. Some were just, you know, were okay. And was he nice to the Scar? No. Was his system perfect? Absolutely not. Not in a million years. But it was pretty crucial and vital for him to be able to control everything so that he could control these outcomes and prepare properly for what he thought was going to be happening with Ruin. Because if he had had a much more democratic system and people got to vote and people were involved in the running and ownership of it, then the caverns wouldn't be a secret, would they? And people would be experimenting with all different types of metal and hemalurgy and arguably, although he made a lot of like hemalurgic beings, which did play into Ruin's hands. But, you know, arguably, if he didn't suppress everything and control everything, someone maybe would have gone to the Well of Ascension and released Ruin earlier. The Ruin would have had an opportunity to influence people. I don't know, I'm just babbling now, but I just think overall what the Lord Ruler was able to do and achieve completely on his own was super impressive, and I'm giving him the MVP award. So what am I reading next? I'll be honest, I don't enjoy just continuing to read one author because they're all different and they all do things well and things not so well. So am I going to continue with the Cosmere? Yes. Is it going to be what I read next? No, it's not. What I'm going to read next is I'm going to go back to Joe Abercrombie. I'm going to be reading Best Served Cold, which is one of the standalone stories. So I read his first trilogy, which is right here. Then there's 3 standalone stories, and then he has a second trilogy. So am I going to read his 3 standalone stories back to back? I don't think so. Maybe I'll come back to Brandon Sanderson after that, but that's what I'm going to read next. However, I did buy this after the poll that was on my page. A lot of people did recommend the Stormlight Archive, but I looked at it and the books preceding it, and it was so big and so long that I just wanted to not commit that heavily to something that big straight away. So I wanted to start with this, which was recommended by a lot of people. And most people recommended it because it runs concurrently with Mistborn Era 1, which I just read. And Kelsier is a heavy character. Was Kelsier one of my favorite characters? No, I don't think I'd get along with him very much in real life. Was he fun to read? Yeah, he was really, really fun to read. So I'm excited to jump into that as well. If you've enjoyed this series of me reading, making predictions, generally just waffling about these books, I did it for the Wheel of Time. I did it for Joe Abercrombie's series, and I'm going to do it for a bunch in the future. So like and subscribe, and we'll see you there. Thank you very much.